music, don't you? No, it's awesome. I'm glad you did.
I just can't help myself.
Yeah, everybody does. But time for Rekha's Voice. Find out what's going on in the register. What's happening, Rekha?
What's happening? Well, this is not so much going on in the register as it is in my column today, which is this recent agreement between it happened this week. The government of Japan announced an official apology to the government of South Korea for Japan's practice of using so-called comfort women during World War II. Now, comfort women, you know what that is? I mean, it's such a misnomer, right? What do you think of?
I have a feeling.
I have a feeling, too, and I didn't even know that was part of the deal.
I think that's a nice terminology being used.
So it makes me think of fuzzy slippers and hot chocolate.
I didn't think that was I didn't think that was a perk.
Yeah,
no, I'd sell that if I were them. But
it's not a perk. But what it was basically that these women in various areas that Japan had occupied, including North and South Korea, Indonesia, and the Philippines and China, were forced into sexual slavery to service the soldiers. And many of them were girls as young as 12 who were plucked out of markets and on the streets and taken to these brothels where they were just forced to have sex, sometimes for months, sometimes for years.
Oh my goodness.
And sometimes they were given false promises about jobs, you know, in factories or in service industries or whatever, and so they agreed, voluntarily went along with these folks and then found themselves, and this was the Japan's military that was doing it, or private companies that, you know, were working at the behest of Japan's military.
They were plucking out of South Korea?
They were keeping them within their countries because these countries were occupied by Japan and the Japanese military was based there, but they were taking them to brothels within their own countries, sometimes in different regions, and keeping them there and forcing them to work. So this didn't come, and this happened in South Korea between 1932 and 1945. And it didn't come out, the practice, until 1991, when a woman who had been a so-called comfort woman, shared her story. And then there was a grudging, at first the government of Japan denied it, then they sort of made a grudging apology in '93. But for 22 years, women in South Korea, who apparently were the biggest group among all of the national groups to have been forced into this. Oops, I'm losing my necklace.
Oh, you're okay.
Sorry.
I have never heard this before.
I haven't either. No, I haven't either.
I just began to learn more about it.
What I'm curious is, why are they apologizing now? What do they think they can do now?
Well, see, this is the interesting part of the story. So, I mean, it's all interesting, but why are they apologizing now has to do with how the survivors are actually accepting the apology. And the reason is because they did make this kind of feeble apology back in '93, but recently the government, the sort of right-wing conservative government in South Korea, or rather in Japan, Shinzo Abe's government, has been trying to pressure the prime minister to kind of deny that it all happened, to take it back, to distance itself from it, to act like it never happened. And so the South Korean government, the prime minister there, is furious at that and says she will not enter any kind of treaties or regional, you know, compacts or whatever, or even meet with the Prime Minister of Japan unless he, you know, comes out firmly and issues a firm apology and makes some reparations. So meanwhile, I mean, they would have no incentive to settle on this, but for the fact that for 22 years, South Korean women have been picketing outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul, South Korea. 22 years.
Seriously?
They've been coming in, and they had erected a big statue which was like a memorial to these comfort women, and they're saying, we need justice. And these women are in their 80s, you know, late 80s, and they have been at this, and they're not that many who are, in South Korea, they're just about 45
There
who are
wouldn't be
still
that many survivors, I would think, but this is all because one woman decided to tell the story?
No, that happened back in the 90s.
Okay.
But what's happening now is it gets into geopolitics, into global geopolitics, right? Because President Obama wants to form a pact with these nations in the region, Southeast Asia and Japan and South Korea, against threats it perceives by China and North Korea. So it says, you guys get this together, you know, stop fighting, figure out a compromise, and just do it, because we need to be allies here. So now, finally, South Korean government comes along and says, okay, we apologize, and here's $8.3 million, which will go into some kind of a foundation in South Korea that will be supposedly used to
I imagine there are children.
Services. There are children. Well, actually, a lot of these women could never have children. For one thing, because they were so bad, their bodies were so badly scarred, and also because they became pariahs. You know, there's such a stigma about losing your virginity before marriage, and nobody wanted to marry them. They were unmarriageable. So those who did have children, those children have grown up with the stigma and shame of all of this. So they finally enter the settlement, and you know, my first instinct on hearing about it in the news was, oh, isn't that nice? You know, apologies are good, and I believe in restorative justice, and it's good for them to finally have articulated exactly what went wrong and what they did wrong, and you know, make it right with some money. And then I spoke to Mira Youssef, who is the executive director of Monsoon, which is an organization here in Des Moines. It's the United Asian Women of Iowa, and they're a sexual assault prevention and domestic violence prevention organization specifically for Asian women. Now, she is of Filipino background, and she came from a region in the Philippines where a lot of these comfort women and girls were recruited from. And so she grew up hearing the stories about the atrocities that happened to them. And I said, isn't this a nice thing? You know, shouldn't everybody hold hands now and be happy? And she said, absolutely not. She said, this is not something that the South Korean women wanted. They did not agree to this settlement. This is just governments at high level which are agreeing with one another for reasons that have nothing to do with the women, but have everything to do with politics, with global politics. And, you know, she said, like, one of the terms of the agreement was that they take down this statue, which they had erected in South Korea, which was a memorial. And
they just want it to
she
go
says
away.
they're just trying to whitewash the whole thing. And what's most important is that it become a part of Japan's history, that it be taught to future generations so that it never happens again. And she said, look at this, you know, there are 45 South Korean women who are survivors currently living, but there are about 60 Filipino women, former comfort women, who are still alive. And there's no settlement with any of those with other countries like Philippines or, you know, North Korea or Indonesia, where even Dutch women who, you know, Indonesia was a Dutch colony for a while, so there are some Dutch women who are also victims of this comfort thing in Indonesia. So it's a really interesting, layered kind of a situation where, you know, what you think immediately is not what meets the eye is not necessarily what's going on beneath the surface.
No, I think what Jason said earlier is the first time hearing about this.
I was gonna say, why aren't more people talking about this?
I know. Why aren't they? I mean, I think partly because Japan has been very successful at burying the thing, and so is its government. And still, there are a lot of deniers. I've looked at a couple of, you know, online news programs, international broadcasts on this, and there are all of these Japanese citizens and kind of apologists for the government who are now denying that it ever happened, or saying these women were voluntary prostitutes. They weren't forced into anything. This is just intended to give Japan a bad name. So, you know, like anything else, there are deniers because they have an investment in it not being true. But we know it's true because there's in fact a documentary that was made by a South Korean American artist, and it has some really amazing testimonials from women and also even from soldiers who say, you know, that this is what happened. These women were forced to have sex with 50 to 100 women a day, and they would just be sitting in these brothels. That's what happened. And then the men would come in one by one and have their way with them and leave.
See, this is why I don't read fiction, because history to me is so much more
devastating.
Interesting. And
you don't need spy thrillers.
There's so much to learn about all the things that.
So we can find that in the paper.
You can
today?
find that in today's paper. Exactly.
What page?
So page 17A. Very good.
Wonderful.
So, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. It was very nice meeting your sons last week, by the way.
Thank you so much. They were so tickled to be here with you guys. They loved it.
They're good guys.
Wow.